Is spiritual formation evidenced in the Bible? Does it involve the use of theology, or is it a spiritual enterprise alone? We discuss spiritual formation from biblical texts today on the Praxology podcast, where theology fuels the mission of the church. We're interested in assisting European leaders to think biblically, reflect theologically, and act missionally. This podcast is a collaboration between Josiah Venture and For Mission College European Campus. I'm your host, Sean Smith, with Tyler Patty. I almost forgot my name. That's kind of awkward.
That was a little awkward.
Welcome back to the studio, Tyler.
Hey, Sean. It's great to be here, as always.
As we jump in, maybe help us to remember our working definition of spiritual formation.
So from last episode, we developed a working definition, and we do want to hear your feedback on it, listeners. If you have any ideas, write it in the chat. If you're on YouTube, send us an email and let us know if this is helpful or not. But here's our working definition of spiritual formation: developing Christian presence to strengthen action through practices embedded in a local community.
Yeah, so we're going to really move towards, again, sort of showing that idea in the text of Scripture. But first, it's helpful to Tyler's reaching up onto our shelf behind us here and pulling out
getting it ready.
Wonderful cover. It's yellow, orange. It's a nice artistic cover from, was it Diane, right?
Diane Chandler.
Diane Chandler. And she introduces spiritual formation, and she labels it as an integrative approach. And what she means by that is there are 7 dimensions that she uses. So we want to unpack some of those dimensions of spiritual formation, and then we'll move into biblical text. So Tyler's excited for that Old Testament portion. We're going to start it in Genesis. As our resident Old Testament scholar, Tyler's always excited to crack that open. But in due time, let's begin.
All right.
With introducing the major categories to help us think further about spiritual formation.
Yep.
Before, so we can have those categories in mind as we're going to the text, and it can be more fruitful.
For sure. So one of the things I appreciate about Diane Chandler's book, Christian Spiritual Formation, published by IVP, the year of our Lord, 2014, it's very just comprehensive, and yet it's very kind of standard as well. Like it's a good place to start. I think most of our listeners are going to say, yeah, that sounds good. We also have some critiques of it, but it's a good place to start. Chandler starts with the Imago Dei as her starting point of the image of God, that being our focus of actually becoming more truly human, we could say, as we reflect God in this world. And she starts with the love of God, and then she goes into 7 different dimensions of spiritual formation.
And she does kind of flatten a lot of theology out and starting with the love of God, because she very, very quickly moves and says, okay, so we're made in the image of God, and that becomes really her starting point for these dimensions. Yeah,
and the 7 dimensions are the formation of the Spirit, which is kind of the governing dimension from which all others are subsets, but formation of the Spirit, emotional formation, that has to do with feelings, passions, desires, relational formation, focusing on the social interactions that we have in our life, and whether we're doing that in healthy ways. Comes to mind. Pete Scazzero's book, The Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, comes to mind there.
It's sitting on my desk right now. We'll bring that in at some point.
Great. Intellectual formation has to do with reason and discernment. That ties in theology, why it's important to think about things deeply and be formed in our thoughts. Yeah. Vocational formation, that's really interesting. Development of practices and habits and skills as we are image bearers in the world, not just called to be Christians isolated from the world, but meant to contribute, meant to work to the glory of God. Physical health formation, caring for our spiritual bodies, being good stewards of the things that God has given us, most personally our bodies, but then also resource formation, which has to do with stewardship of the other things that we've been given, stewardship of the earth and its resources. This, again, it makes sense in the context of starting with the image of God, because the first humans were commanded to multiply and subdue the earth and basically care for it and cause it to be more fruitful in their care of creation, not to just use it up, but actually to be good stewards.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, what do you think? What do you think about that as a starting place?
Yeah, I mean, nobody really can argue with these 7 dimensions. The question just becomes, are those the highest level possible? In other words, couldn't other things be included? I mean, basically. These are good general categories, but it does leave one to wonder where certain other things might fit. The role of, again, pain, the role of suffering, and so on. It crosses over into several of these categories, formation of the spirit, emotional, relational. But do some of these things deserve their own category? She doesn't really explore that from what I'm recalling of the book at the moment. But what about communication? I mean, she doesn't really talk about that. It probably could fit well under her relational dimension, but it's not only that. So I mean, to be fair, these are ways we can talk about spiritual formation to have those broader level categories to make sure that we're not just focusing on one area and going astray.
Yeah, absolutely.
So these are meant to be truly categories and not like definitive end all. But it does sort of beg a question of like, are these the only dimensions? I mean, are there others? Before we can deal with those items, it's helpful to see what Chandler's overall assumptions are about the process, and then we'll use this to jump into the Bible. But before giving any critique, it's great that she points out from Simon Chan that, quote, God acts within human activity. That just fits nicely with everything that we say on this podcast. That God acts within human activity, even while giving automatic fruit. Like there are certain things that God does that we just have as blessings in Christ. And there are also other ways where this Spirit is acting and moving forward and helping to cause growth. That it's not automatic. There's this participation element to it, which I'm going to pause myself and not go down that rabbit trail. But there is a tension here that sometimes God just gives stuff, and that sometimes he uses our neuropsychological processes. And really, this is great nuance that Chandler is trying to bring into the text. She has a wonderful text overall. It does have some assumptions. So let's get into those quickly. She begins the process with God's love, as we've said, as the foundation of us being made in God's image. That sounds great. I mean, right? Do you want to argue against this, Tyler? Probably not.
Yeah, it sounds great.
Yeah, and so she says on page 20 that godly love is the essence of God's character and personality, proceeding from the Father, wonderful Trinitarian language, as demonstrated by the Son through the work of the Holy Spirit, which unconditionally upholds the highest good of others and fosters the same altruism, focus on doing good, and benevolence in human relationships without regard for the personal sacrifice. And then she just moves on. Like, this is some great foundational stuff that to encapsulate. And when she says God is love, this is what she means.
That's right. And that's really, I think, really helpful. It's one thing to say, spiritual formation starts with God's love, and it be very general. But this is actually very specifically tied to God's being and his action as well.
Which, again, is why we need to study theology, so we can know these matters.
Hey, good plug.
It could make sense to start spiritual formation as the subjective believer's part of the process. Mm-hmm. Like there's a give and a take. There's two sides of the relationship. There's the believer. There's God. It could make sense to start spiritual formation as the believer, from the believer's perspective, because that's our experience in the world. I'm formed out of my image-bearing nature, kind of idea. But this perhaps doesn't go far enough back to the starting point and maybe repeat some of the same mistakes of not beginning with God himself in the context of mission that we've previously talked about in season 1.
That's right. So it doesn't, the story doesn't start with us and our role. It actually starts with God and his mission and his character.
Yeah, we've shown that mission is rooted in God and his character specifically, which is how we can discuss missional rest and the like in missional context. It is God's project, something we have to remind ourselves of, and not just something that we do, even though we do spiritual practices and things like this. So similarly, I wonder if this repeats the same mistake in spiritual formation talk by not beginning more explicitly with God. She does have wonderful Trinitarian theology as a basis, but then like in the next paragraph moves into the idea of so imago Dei, we're created in God's image, and moves forward there. So maybe some more explicit theology as of God as the backdrop could be useful.
I think that's a fairly accurate representation of the way that we're often we approach these things. Like, okay, yes, God, but what about me? It's especially if it's related to my formation, it's very easy to then become sort of selfish, or at least to lose sight of the bigger picture and how actually my formation fits into God and his project and how I am connected to him and am participating with him in what he's doing. So maybe even for our listeners, it's a good challenge to say, as you think about your own growth and formation, don't just think about yourself, but do think about God and think about his character and his mission.
Again, who do we want to become when we grow up?
That's right.
Who do we want to be like when we grow up? In Chandler's text, the ontology of God, God's being, who God is. That's ontology, is being. And so the ontology of God is sort of assumed. That's really the point that we're coming to here in her framework of spiritual formation, but never really drawn out. And because it's never really drawn out, here's why I think it matters. If there are some theological connections that are missing, and thereby it's creating a wonderful picture of spiritual formation, but maybe not as holistic as it possibly could be, given the nature that she does have 7 dimensions.
Yeah.
This is quite difficult to prove. For those on YouTube, you can see I'm using air quotes. For those listening, I'm using air quotes because can we actually prove this is another question. But the point is that we move from a general love, like generalized version of it, even if it's an accurate depiction of who God is, to how we are formed in his image. Well, we're missing what comprises his image specifically. Things like patience, that Tyler wants to talk about at some point.
I want to talk about it.
Creativity, and so on. We'll try to draw these things out from the biblical text that we're about to move into, and try to correct, and not just, it's one thing to critique a text like this. It's another thing to put something forward. That what we hope to work towards that. Spiritual formation, starting with seeing in the biblical text how it is rooted in God's character. Very important. All of God's character, not just summarizing it with love and moving forward, rooted in God's specific character and moves into the person. So the person learns about God's character. That's the living theology. And it connects to practice through being spiritually formed. So our working premise in this episode is really that theology is connected with spiritual formation, and that it runs in the background for it to work rightly. Tyler, any thoughts as we segue into trying to look at this in the context of Scripture itself?
I think you said it well. I'm excited to look at some texts.
Let's do it.
Okay, great. Hold me back.
No longer. You are released.
Oh yes. Okay. So we're gonna look at. I mean, there's so much. Just okay. As we were brainstorming, just for context of the listeners, as we were brainstorming about examples of formation in the Old Testament in particular. There were just so many things that popped into my head. I mean, thinking in terms of formation of Adam and Eve, the formation of Noah was a really interesting one. The formation of the patriarchs is just fascinating to see how God both kind of just patiently walks with them as they keep fighting the same battles and losing the same battles, in their personal growth and in their relational disharmony in their family. One of my favorite ones of how God transforms and forms someone is the story of Judah, which is, I hope we get to another time. My firstborn son is named Judah because of this particular story, and it's a story that we often skip over. But then looking forward, the formation of Moses to be this, to be the right kind of person that God could use to bring his people out of slavery, and we could keep going. But I think going to Abraham is a really great place to start when we think about formation in the context or in light of God's own character. So in Genesis 12, God calls Abraham and says, go to a place that I'm going to tell you, and you're going to be a blessing to the nations. I'm going to bless you. You're going to be a blessing, and so on and so forth. And then God makes a covenant with him in Genesis 15, where he starts to teach him about his character and who he is as God and what he wants his relationship with God with Abraham to be. Mm-hmm. We have to remember that Abram at this point, he's a pagan. We hold him up as this great figure of faith. Obviously, the Bible, the Old Testament and New Testament, talk about the faith of Abram as being super, super important and foundational, and but that faith was small, it was growing, it was not automatic. He's coming from a pagan context. His dad is a moon worshiper from Mesopotamia, and God is working with Abram to teach him about himself and to make him into the kind of person and the kind of family that can be a blessing to the world. Anything you want to say at this point before I just keep going?
Just that actually is a really good picture of spiritual formation. I realize that's the point that we're moving towards. But God moving in his direction, and Abraham over the course of time realizing who God is. And that had to have been at least part of his inner psychology of working out in the world what God told him to do. Therefore, a type of commission. Therefore, go. He sent Abraham out. It's not. There's some things referenced there in biblical theology of mission. Ultimately, really not the point here. But through that process, we see that it truly was a process where Abraham's becoming. Like he comes from pagan background. God draws near to him. God uses him. And he's looking to God, and he has to be using that, I think, to motivate him to want to continue to look like God in the context of ancient Mesopotamian moon worship and things like that.
Absolutely. So in Genesis 15, in this amazing covenant ceremony where God puts Abram to sleep, and then
this is amazing.
At first he tells him cut up some animals, and then he makes him fall asleep, and then there's this pillar of fire. This fire is smoking pot that passes through these pieces, and in this moment God says, I'm going to be the guarantor of this covenant. I'm going to make sure that this covenant is kept. You can't even do anything right now. You're asleep. And so I will do these things for you, really, really honing in on the fact that the key to any success of Abraham and his family is God. God is the one who has to bring about the things that he has promised him. And we're seeing, as you mentioned, that Abraham is learning about God's character because he doesn't know him yet. Maybe that's a good reflection for us as well. One of the things we talk about in our program and in the context of theological reflection is don't assume. Don't assume you know what God is doing. We have all these assumptions of, of course God is doing these things. Of course God acts like this. But we actually don't stop to ask and reflect and think, who are you, God? What sorts of things do you do? And so we see that I think that God is doing that with Abraham in Genesis 18. Mm-hmm. So in Genesis 18, this fascinating story where there's these three visitors that show up to Abraham's house. One of them seems to be God, sort of, angel of the Lord that speaks with God's voice. And the angel of God reiterates some of the promises that God had given to Abram. about his family, and
God likes to do that.
God loves to do that. And then and then we'll jump into our story in Genesis 18, starting with verse 16. When the men got up to leave, they looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. So Sodom is a town that Abraham's nephew Lot had moved to. And earlier, God had said, I'm going to go investigate. I'm going to go check things out because it seems like things are not totally kosher. That's going to be a joke for later. Kosher salt. And it's so interesting that he's going to investigate, and then he thinks, Abram's along for the journey. He's joining God in what he's going to go check out. And in verse 17 it says, then the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all the nations on earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised him. So here there's some self-reflection of God, sort of weird, interesting insight into what God is thinking. He basically says, I've promised these things to Abraham. Why wouldn't I let him in on the process? Because he actually needs to know who I am and how I think about these sorts of things. If he's going to be a good light to the nations, if he's going to be a good blessing and representative of me to the nations. And if he and his children, he needs to direct his children and his household after him. If they're going to be able to keep the way of the Lord, he needs to learn what that is and kind of not just learn it in his head, but actually kind of practice it out. Through participation. Exactly. Absolutely. So at this moment, God actually invites Abraham into the process. And it says in verse 20, then the Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin so grievous, that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know. And then in this, God is inviting Abraham to participate and to discover how he approaches these sorts of very, very thorny, tricky issues. Do you have anything to say at this point?
I do. One of them is tangential on how God works with people to learn.
Uh-huh.
God doesn't just dictate things vast majority of the time. And in here, he says, no, I'm going to let you in on the process. And he's actually thinking on behalf of Abraham. How is Abraham going to learn best? That's amazing for several reasons that I'm preoccupied with. However, it's amazing that within that, the level to which we see God moving towards Abraham, whom you've mentioned has a history of a family not being worshipers of God. And we see God moving like that specifically to his level and saying, Abraham, this is how much I love you, so that you can become like me. I want you to participate and learn, and that's not always easy. And that entails a lot of things that he had to learn along the way in being spiritually formed.
That's right. Oh, and just to pick up on that statement as well, that God really meets him where he's at. And that's of great comfort to us who want to be spiritually formed, that it's
Absolutely.
not this unattainable, lofty, crazy, never achievable, place where we have to somehow climb up to God. But God really does meet us where we're at and then take us where we need to go. That's kind of the story of the Bible and the story of Genesis for sure. So God invites Abraham into this process. And so it says in verse 22, the men turned away and went towards Sodom, but Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Then Abraham approached him and said, will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it? Far be it for you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right? some amazing theological reflection going on there of like,
Yeah.
I think this is true about you, God, but I need to be sure. Let's put this out, and you need to tell me, am I thinking about this rightly?
Yeah.
And he's saying, God, I know, like, I think that you're righteous, and I think that you're a just judge. How are you? Here's how I would approach this sort of a problem, knowing who you are. What do you think about that? Essentially. And God actually engages, and he says, if I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake. And if you know the story, you know that it just keeps on escalating, where Abraham presses in again, and he says, oh, okay, but what about for 40? And he says, or 45 actually. What about? And God says, okay, yes, you understand me correctly. 45, yes. And he says, what about 40? Yes. What about 30 righteous people? Yes. And then after 30, he said, Abraham's like, feels like he's maybe pushing the envelope too much. And he says, now that I've been so bold as to speak to the Lord, what if only 20 could be there? He's testing and seeing how far God's patience and his mercy and his justice extend. He's kind of pressing the boundaries and discovering with God his character and how that plays out in the world. God says 20, yes. And Abraham finally says, what about 10? And he says, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. When the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he left, and Abraham returned home. We don't have time to get into how the story continues. You could read about it in Genesis 19, but focusing just on the formation of Abraham, this is an incredible moment where he is invited into God's own thinking about this very difficult issue, and encouraged to reflect on how God's character influences his perspective on the world and his own growth. We see him growing in his understanding of God's mercy in this story, and it's all in the context of, Abraham, you need to know who I am. Your children need to know who I am, so that you can actually live it out and be a blessing and mediate me to the world. Yes.
Yeah, it's just amazing. And maybe I'll just point out, because of our critique from Chandler, that this is directly rooted in, we could say generally, God's love.
Right.
But we miss the point if we just summarize it and leave it there, right?
Absolutely.
We see so many other elements of God's character. God, it is kind of awkward to think about, like self-consciously reflecting, what should I do? And then letting him into the process, which means God is patient, because, I mean, come on, we're humans, right?
Come on.
We are finite. We are not all-knowing. And by definition, that means God's love has to be patient, amidst many other characteristics that we could point out. But we don't want to miss those things as we go by, because the entire process of becoming like Christ, that missional presence and moving towards action peace in our development, comes from who God is. And we saw that at the beginning of even looking at Genesis here, that it's just like God always reminds people, and he always tells his people to remember what I've done in the past. Remember that I am what? Faithful.
Absolutely.
So that's another aspect of who God is that we shouldn't miss, because what are we trying to do in spiritual formation? Become like Christ. Okay, we want to be at least patient like he was, faithful like he is, and so on and so forth. So that's part of the point of that critique from earlier. Any final things that you want to say on Abraham before we maybe jump into? I think we'll have time for one more.
Great. Let's briefly look then. As I mentioned, there's so many other stories we could look at, but just to illustrate maybe how to engage in such a process with God. I don't think that most of us have the experiences of God sending an angel to walk us to a cliff to look at a city and have some nice theological reflection in the desert together. So what does it look like for us to engage in that sort of wrestling with God that actually forms us as we discern who God is and how that impacts how we live in the world and who we become. So the Psalms are a great place for
Absolutely.
that, because this shows how to it's a picture into life with God, essentially.
Yeah.
Very, very easily accessible for us. So let's take a look at Psalm 63. And Sean, you've been looking at this psalm quite a bit recently in the context of your own teaching.
Yeah.
So why don't you walk us through this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one thing that I would point out along the way, and we saw Abraham doing it too. He had to reflect. He was sort of theologically reflecting, like, am I pushing it too much? God's character. Okay, I'm going to move forward with it. How about 10?
Yeah.
So there's an element of theological reflection, just caught up in all of this process, and we really, really can see that. I want to point this out in Psalm 63, and this connects with, a lot of what we've said before. Missional rest, and those kinds of things are sort of in the background, where we have to stop and reflect. It is a process of becoming, and it has that outward focus towards doing, but if we don't reflect on God's character,
That's right.
then we're not going to be what's the right word I want to use? Transformed into the same image. Who do we want to be when we grow up? Spiritually mature in Christ. No longer dependent upon that milk. We want the strong, like the meat.
Give us the meat. Yeah, absolutely.
That nice piece of steak or whatever in your country favorite meat happens to be.
Or maybe like a vegan patty. That's also totally acceptable. We have a vegan restaurant across from our office.
It's actually really good.
It's actually really good. So, yep.
Surprisingly, Tyler had to convince me of this. We went there, and wow, the traditional Czech meal there is really good. Psalm 63, getting into some meat. O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water. So I have looked upon you in the sanctuary, beholding your power and your glory. And you may remember this from a song. A modern worship song is like directly these words here. Beholding your power and glory. Because your steadfast love is better than life, my lips will praise you. So I will bless you as long as I live. In your name I will lift up my hands. And maybe that's hopefully our posture now as we continue to read. My soul will be satisfied as with fat. See, meat.
There you go. Exactly.
And rich food. And my mouth will praise you with joyful lips. When I remember you upon my bed and meditate on you in the watches of the night. For you have been my help, and in the shadow of your wings I will sing for joy. My soul clings to you. Your right hand upholds me. But those who seek to destroy my life shall go down into the depths of the earth. Some imprecatory things here. They shall be given over to the power of the sword. They shall be a portion for jackals. But the king shall rejoice in God. All who swear by him shall exult, for the mouths of liars will be stopped. And that is in the future tense, will be. We do have that promise that God is faithful to those who are faithful to him. And that's where some of that imprecatory stuff begins to make sense. That's a side point in the Psalms. Starting in verse 1, though, this is a really good picture of, again, theological reflection of David when he's in a chaotic place. Like he's not in his home on his equivalency of an ancient couch, probably not having rich actual food or meat of any kind. He's in the wilderness, and it's barren. There's nothing there. It's a dangerous place to be, and he finds himself there, just like a lot of the people who watch sheep. What are they called?
Shepherds.
Just like the simplest things I forget. Whatever. The shepherds oftentimes sort of staying awake in the watches of the night. Sometimes if there are prey out to get the sheep, having to literally watch over the sheep. So some beautiful, beautiful pictures here. And we see first and foremost in verse 1, "O God, you are my God." A declaration, spiritual formation, right, has that declaration of looking towards the right image. God, you are my God.
Yes.
And that is,
Yes.
see that reflective is like looking in a, maybe not, that's not the right example, but as we're saying that, it's doing something within us. Earnestly I seek you. Earnestly, that we see at the very least spiritual formation here. Chandler does talk about this as well, is deeply rooted in the emotive world. And why do we like to make psalms and sing them? And why do we remember songs over other things? Because they just have a way of reaching to our emotions. And if we can teach, if we can do things like that reach to the level of emotions properly without manipulation, that actually really, really helps to learn, helps other people to learn. But at the very least, we see that this is a holistic enterprise from David, who writes this psalm. You are my God, earnestly I seek you. In fact, my soul is thirsting for you. He's probably thirsty. He needs something to drink. And we're like, I don't have a lot, but he's resting in God's character. My God is faithful. He is with me in the middle of nowhere where it's dangerous. And I don't have everything I physically need, but he is with me and I can get through it. That's sort of like what like if I was in that situation, that's what I'm picturing him to be doing. So I have looked upon you, verse 2. I have looked upon you in the sanctuary. It's interesting. I think he's doing some reflection here. He's theologically reflecting of when like right now he's in the wilderness, but he wasn't.
That's right.
And he knows he probably will not be for more than just a period of time. And saying, I thirst for you. I long for you. And there's kind of an element of firmness that he knows that God knows that, and that God is going to be with him rather than just hoping that God will not be distant. Because he says, I've looked upon you in the sanctuary. I've spent time in your presence.
Yeah.
You are forming me.
I've gotten to know you. I've beheld your power and your glory. Amazing.
And he does summarize, to be fair to Chandler, because your steadfast love is better than life. So there's some summary there, but we see so much more of a rich picture of God that has to be the nature of how we're being formed. Otherwise, we miss some things in spiritual formation. And then there's this element of participation that as we're becoming, we're doing like what Peterson says in those Psalms of Ascent. I will bless you as long as I live. In your name, I will lift up my hands. If you picture that, maybe that's you listening now. You're like, I feel like I'm not in the literal desert, but it feels like I am. Be comforted by this text. I in your name, I will lift up my hands, knowing that I don't have everything I need, but you are a faithful God, and you are with me. Father, help. It's kind of another picture, I think, of David saying this. And if we move forward, even verse 8, my soul clings to you. It's like an element of, the psalmists do this a lot. They speak to their own souls. He's kind of doing it here. My soul it's going to do it because you are worth it, because I know that you are here with me. And so there's a lot of rich picture of him as he's writing this, literally being transformed. But Tyler, I'm going to pause myself because I see you've got some Hebrew pulled open next to your very nice
I suspected
Bible here.
I suspected something. I just wanted to make sure that I was reading it correctly. So you had mentioned the love piece, it actually it doesn't have to do with God's emotions necessarily. It actually does have to do with his loyalty, his faithfulness, because the word here is it's kitov chastecha, which is for better is your chesed, your loving kindness, your covenantal faithfulness. Lots of different ways to translate that. It's such a rich theological word that has to do with God's character, his love expressed in loyalty. And so it very much ties to what
Mm-hmm.
to what we're talking about. That being the foundation for his hope is saying, God, you've been faithful to me before. You've poured out your love, not just as an emotion or as but you've been steadfast. So just wanted to point that out.
Yeah. And maybe if you can get there faster than me, we'll read that definition one more time of our spiritual formation. My notes here are not working properly.
Great, I've got it.
Perfect.
So our definition of spiritual formation: developing Christian presence to strengthen action through practices embedded in a local community.
Yeah, and those things, interestingly enough, the practice that David went through is reenacted every time that we read this together.
Yeah.
So that's a rich picture of embedded in a local community. He was by himself, but now this is so much entrenched in the entirety of the Bible. It helps us to see God's faithfulness. And it is worthy, again, of noting that he is theologically reflecting on his past experience with God and who God is. And by definition, he's doing theology of the living God, knowing that his soul will be satisfied with fat and rich food at some point. But those are just two stories. Maybe next time we'll unleash Tyler and he can talk about Judah. We will sort of go into the New Testament in the next episode and sort of flesh out this definition of spiritual formation more.
I'll allow it because Jesus was from the line of Judah, so.
Exactly, yes. So next time we will build spiritual formation and theology from the New Testament also, perhaps continuing on the Old Testament briefly. We'll see. And then perhaps we'll begin to nuance some of those 7 dimensions from Chandler and start to add some of those things that we've nuanced up to this point of like community. What does that look like? Patience. What exactly does that mean? Communication, so on and so forth. But for now, we say go in peace, setting your eyes on things above, Colossians 3:1, and think biblically, reflect theologically, and act missionally, knowing that you are being formed into the very character of God. See you next time.
See you next time.